right, it's 26 minutes before 11 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in this nice-looking Thursday morning. Do you know what I have, Robin, I found the other day?
What's that?
I found an old map. My grandparents moved to Florida, I think in 1964, 65, something like that. And when they moved to Florida, I was still a kid up in New York, and all of a sudden I was in love with this peninsula. All of a sudden, I wanted to know everything about it because my grandparents lived here. And so I had this map, like a road map. You could get it from the Texaco station for free of the United States, right? And there was a guy at the station who told me that if I sent a letter to the map maker, they'll send me a free one of Florida.
Nice.
I did this, and that's how I ended up with the map. All right. So a lot has changed since 65. But one of the things, if you look at my old map, I still have it. If you look at the area that is now called Disney, it is a swamp. It's got these little like hash lines, little tiny lines that indicate that there's a swamp there. And so Disney literally, and I'm not telling you anything nobody knew already, but it literally was a swamp. Last week when we were, a couple weeks ago when we were still pumping out the water that was the result of Hurricane Irma coming through, you could see some of the areas that easily could be underwater again. For example, Payne's Prairie between here and Gainesville. Mm-hmm. I think that used to be called, what did they call it? Alachua Lake.
Oh, okay.
I think. And then somehow the water drained out and all the paddle boat businesses had to go out of business. That must have been crazy, right?
Yeah, that must have been awesome for paddle boats up there.
So we have an amazing book to talk about right now. Michele Currie Navakas is the author. Hope I pronounced her name wrong. I mean, right. I probably did it wrong. The book is called Liquid Landscape, Geography and Settlement at the Edge of Early America. Michele is an assistant professor of English and teaches early American literature and culture at Miami University of Ohio. She was born and raised in South Florida. Is Miami University in Ohio part of the Miami in Florida?
Oh, gosh.
We'll find out. Michele Currie Navakas. Good morning, Michele. I think I probably get your first and middle name right. I'm not sure how I did on your last name. Good morning, Michele.
No. Hi. No, that's okay. It's Navakas, but that's fine.
See, it sounds so much better when you say it. Navakas. Okay. All right. I will practice it now in my head as you talk. So thank you for being on the air today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So how did you go up in South Florida and end up going to school called Miami in Ohio? What is that?
It's super confusing for everyone. Basically, it's actually not related. From what I understand and what I've read, the reason Miami University of Ohio is called that is the local tribe is the Miamia people, which is different from why Miami, Florida is called Miami, Florida. And that I think is because the name of Lake Okeechobee in some early native language sounds like Miami, and that's why that's called Miami. So it's actually not related, which is so interesting.
Live streaming as we're talking to you, and it's just not working.
Okay.
But you do focus on Florida in your book. You talk about the swamp, you talk about the hammock, you talk about the Everglades. You've got detailed maps in there, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, that's right. I think basically to talk a little bit about why I wrote the book, it's mostly because when we think about our nation's founding in the 18th and 19th centuries, I don't think we think about Florida. We tend to think about particular geography. So usually New England comes to mind, maybe the Mid-Atlantic region. What I wanted to do in this book is really revise that thinking, since early Americans all across the continent were actually pretty preoccupied with Florida. So if you look at, say, even the founders of our nation, like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, to many popular writers we still know today. So we have Harriet Beecher Stowe, for example, or James Fenimore Cooper, to just everyday people in early America, like farmers and like slaveholders. These people were actually thinking about the land and populations of Florida. And actually, that's mainly because Florida posed a direct challenge to a lot of aspects of the early nation. So things like slavery, commerce, and even concepts of settlement. Because settlement in Florida was so unique and took such different forms.
And you also talk about the authentic narrative of the Seminole War, the horrid massacres of the whites by the Indians and the Negroes in Florida.
That is the 19th century title of a particular text that is definitely one of my favorites because it's so interesting. It actually really captures the violence of U.S. expansion during this time period into Florida and the ways that the U.S. military was trying to erase and remove these local populations of Seminole and their allies who were people who were escaping slavery in other parts of the U.S. South to come to Florida for freedom.
Wow. Locally, we have Silver Springs. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And there's a statue there of Osceola. And underneath the statue is a plaque that tells in one paragraph the story of how basically he and his people were kicked out of here.
Absolutely. That's so interesting to think about the ways that people now remember the Seminole War. And I'm guessing in your area it's more obvious, those reminders, because I think that what's interesting to me is you can talk to a lot of people about Florida and they have no sense or no awareness of these violent wars of imperial expansion that took place in the 19th century. But it sounds like you have reminders there.
Tell me about the role that geography played in regards to the colonization of Florida. Like my description of my old 1965 map.
So interesting, yeah.
I mean, you had to have money, and I guess Disney had it, but you had to have money in order to take a swamp and make it into usable land.
You sure did. Yeah, and before the modern engineering transformed the landscape, if you think about it, I mean, during the period I write about, more than half of Florida's 20 million acres was actually swampland. And that is not the case today, but it was then. And you're right, that posed a significant challenge for expansion. So it wasn't just the populations, but it was the ways that those populations managed to live on and claim this landscape that many people from other parts of the U.S., including the federal government, could not figure out how to walk through, let alone map. The first really comprehensive map of the region south of Lake Okeechobee didn't even take place until the late 19th century, despite many efforts on behalf of the U.S. government to map the state, which wasn't a state then. It was just this, peninsula that mostly belonged to Spain for a lot of the 18th and the 19th century too.
So with the landscape, the land itself being difficult to walk through, etc. Who was the first colonist? Was it DeSoto? Who was the first Spaniard? DeSoto?
Yeah, probably. I'm thinking that far back. I'm somehow blanking, but that that sounds about right. The period my book focuses on is mostly Revolution, the U.S. Revolution through Reconstruction. But what's interesting is during that period, a lot of people were looking back at those early Spanish sources of the first people who encountered Florida in order to get information about the landscape, because there was so little information that they had to sort of look back at these early maps created by people like DeSoto, and Cabeza de Vaca was another person who spent some time in Florida during that early period of Spanish.
You know what's amazing? What's amazing to me is that as how accurate the maps were. I mean, I know they're not accurate, but if you sent me someplace and said, "All right, I want you to walk this area. It's about 500 miles long and about 100 miles wide, and I want you to kind of map it out." I don't think I'd even come close to making it look like what these look like. These maps are amazing.
Yeah, it's interesting that you should say that, because one story I tell in the book is the mapping of Florida between the 16th and the 19th centuries. And during that period, there was a lot of debate about what Florida actually looked like. So in the book, there are some people that I talk about who say, you know what, Florida is definitely a peninsula. And then other people during that period say, no, it's not. It's an island. It's actually completely independent of the continent. And then other people come along and say, actually, it's many islands. And so you get all these maps that show Florida as multiple islands. I don't know if you saw those in the book, but
you did. I did, yeah.
Yeah, but what's interesting about those, it's interesting that you say accurate, because those island maps are often based on indigenous populations telling European map makers and European settlers or explorers, hey, the best way to describe this landscape is as islands, because it's so changeable and shifting that islands kind of just made more sense. So in some ways, even though that's inaccurate, we know Florida was never a bunch of islands, there is a real accuracy to that, it's interesting.
And you use the phrase the Florida Reef, and I had never heard that before.
Oh, that's really interesting. Well, I guess that's what I refer to as the entire, all the things we think of as the Keys, for example. During that period, people would call all of that the Florida Reef, yeah.
Did you ever hear that the Appalachian Mountain Range actually ends in Key West. It goes underneath the Gulf, and that have you ever heard that?
I actually have. Where did you hear that? That's so interesting.
I don't remember. We speak to 100 guests a year or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Well, what's even more interesting is during this period, some people were making the claim that there was an undersea mountain range that connected Florida to South America, and that the Caribbean, all those islands, were just the tops of those mountain ranges. And so the idea was sort of like, from the U.S. perspective, the idea was actually, all of those places in the Caribbean naturally belong to the U.S. We shouldn't colonize them because, look, they're connected. It's a mountain range. So there's all kinds of ways that geography is informing culture and politics, and that might be one of them. That's an interesting observation.
Well, we've been looking at the dry Tortugas as a place to go, and you bring that up in your book with Fort Jefferson. I found that fascinating.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know about the dry Tortugas at all. I think that's been my experience. Usually when I tell people about the dry Tortugas and about the history of Fort Jefferson, they're like, "What are you talking about? I've never heard of this." Have you ever seen pictures of Fort Jefferson?
Yeah, I want to go there. It looks beautiful. It looks beautiful. You can camp there too. They have a campground.
I have heard that, right? Because the National Park Service now runs it, and you can take like a ferry from Key West 7 miles out and stay there overnight.
Yeah, but you can't. There's certain things you can't do, and I can't remember what they are now. But and we learned why it was called dry. That the sailors had no fresh water on those islands, so they called them dry, even though they had plenty of water.
That's so interesting. I don't even think I knew that because, in the book, mostly what I'm focusing on is the U.S. trying to build Fort Jefferson there, starting in 1846, and the way that the minute they start building the fort starts sinking. So in the book, what I do is I use that as a case or a story that tells us about the lessons of failing to adapt to a liquid landscape. Since so many of the stories I tell in the book are about people who successfully adapted to a shifting landscape and managed to remain on it, by figuring out different ways to live and settle. But that's my example of like how not to do things. The fort never really worked out.
So the political landscape of this state seems to be separate from the rest of the eastern coast also, especially during colonial days. I know you mentioned the slave part of our history in regards to Florida. I've often wondered if Florida wasn't a place to escape to and then became a slave state. What is his exact story? What happened there?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, most of the period that I'm focusing on, Florida is a real plantation culture never really flourished throughout Florida. There were, if you think about other parts of the U.S. South, you think about Alabama, Mississippi, you're thinking probably from the antebellum period, you think of like these massive plantations of like cotton and things like that. And that only happened in Florida in a few select places. So near Tallahassee, for example, was one of those places, and then also near Jacksonville. But for the most of the state, it was just impossible. So even if slavery was, allowed, there wasn't a way to build those massive plantations, which is why a lot of the state, even well through the Civil War, remained this refuge. We often think of people running north, to escape slavery, but so many people came south to Florida. And lived in the Everglades and managed to make lives, form communities, live there for generations. That story of escaping south to slavery actually began in the 17th century under Spanish rule. So that there were generations of people living in Florida who had left plantations throughout the U.S. South.
Yeah, and in the book you write, Africans enjoyed legal freedom under Spanish rule. And you also write, Africans in Florida did nothing to provoke U.S. aggression since they were quietly enjoying their freedom. So what happened after the Spanish lost the land? Then that changed everything for them?
Well, what happens is the U.S. gets very nervous about the fact of a massive population of freed persons living, with the Seminole Indians in Florida under Spanish rule. Often the Spanish were arming those populations because it was to everyone's advantage to resist or to just keep out the U.S., who was trying to, exterminate these populations. So finally, this becomes intolerable, and in 1818, Andrew Jackson invades Florida and is just, has had enough of this massive threat threat that the place is posing to U.S. slavery throughout the South. The fear was that people would just continue to escape, and then it would really affect slavery badly. But it took actually 3 wars of a major aggression and violence against Florida's population for the U.S. to really claim Florida. So these are the Seminole Wars, which I know you're familiar with, and there were 3 throughout over about a 40-year period during the 19th century. So it was very, very difficult for the U.S. to claim Florida. It wasn't, they always wanted to claim it, but it took a lot of labor and violence and money and men to actually make that happen.
And you had written in your book that the black people that came over joined forces with the Seminoles, and they were massacring the Europeans, the white people.
Yeah, that definitely happened, and I think they had pretty good reason to do so, because a lot of times they were not, they weren't the ones who began the aggressions. The historians have shown that it's mostly the U.S. trying to claim Florida that is invading. They come south to try, like people, like even planters would come into Florida to try to take back, or in some cases just take black persons who had escaped from plantations throughout the South. And so for that reason, those populations then responded with violence, and absolutely, that's why we get that captivity narrative that you mentioned earlier. A lot of the Europeans who would go to Florida would end up, being taken captive, or have some kind of retaliation against them for the U.S. military invading and messing with their families, messing with their lives.
Do you go as far into the future at that time as the War of 1812?
I do talk about that because that's kind of in the middle, but not that much. Yeah, what interested you about that? Yeah.
Well, because a lot of the discussion lately about taking a knee during the NFL games has to do with the national anthem and has to do with, I think, the 3rd or the 4th verse, it says no refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. I don't have that memorized. I had to look it up. But I often wondered, are we not understanding what what's his name again? Scott?
Francis Scott Key.
Yes. Yeah. I often wonder, are we misunderstanding what he was trying to say there?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I do not feel qualified to answer that. But it depends. What do you think his interpretation, or what is your interpretation of what he's trying to say?
Well, it looks like everybody's trying to save themselves from this battle, and everybody, including like it says, no refuge could save the hireling. I'm guessing those are indentured servants or something.
Sure, probably.
So the hireling and slave, no refuge could save them from the terror that they were facing right there. And I don't know what it means, to be honest with you. That's why I was asking you.
I don't either, but you're making me realize that I want to pay more attention to that. I've been hearing about that controversy, but I haven't read enough about it, and it's really relevant. So I'm gonna learn more. I appreciate you bringing that up.
You've got so much in the book, though, and I want to make sure we're fair to the book. The book is called Liquid Landscape. I love the title. I love the connection that you've made between the political landscape and the actual landscape.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I mean, the title is definitely referring to the fluidity, the actual physical fluidity of Florida, because where else do you have limestone foundations, plus swamps, plus sinkholes, plus changing shoreline, plus hurricanes being ravaging the land. So it's that liquidity and fluidity, but it is exactly like you're saying, it's also the fluidity of the populations who are continually coming to Florida, staying for a little while, leaving again, circulating through, and they didn't just come from the North American continent. They would also come from the Caribbean and stay in Florida, form networks of commerce and trade with people there. So there was this whole fluid and circulating groups of people in enclaves. So yes, I was trying to capture both of those and the kind of ways that people throughout the North American continent actually were really aware of and paying attention to that fluidity.
And you do talk about the hurricanes. You bring them up, and you talk about the effect of a hurricane on Lake Okeechobee, and I never realized that. I just thought it was too far inland to be affected, but you opened my eyes on that.
Yeah, that's I think that's probably in the coda to the book where I talk about Zora Neale Hurston. She in Their Eyes Are Watching God which is this 1937 novel, it's partly based on the hurricane of 1928, and the story of that hurricane is just, to me, totally astonishing because it swept in over the peninsula from the east coast. I think it hit land at 130 miles per hour, and it was so powerful that it did, in fact, as you're saying, it broke the dike holding Lake Okeechobee back. It flooded the land, and nearly 2,000 people were killed. And those people were mostly black persons and poor persons doing things like migrant labor. And, what's interesting to me, I don't know what you think about this, but, a lot of people today are kind of complain about getting excessive warnings for hurricanes and saying, it's too much and it's too dramatic and the media overblows it. But, I always think about what was it like before any warning was possible, and there was no official warning during this time period. So I always have to think about that.
Exactly. I love the early warnings. I'm one of those that appreciate.
I do too.
In the intro, I was mentioning a prairie north of us and south of Gainesville, between the two cities, and in early illustrations of that lake, when it was a lake, it showed paddle boats being used on that lake, and then I guess it dried up. And then with the last storm, I guess one of the levees broke, and now it looks like a lake again if you drive over it, but it must be a very shallow lake. I'm thinking it's not very deep.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I don't know about that lake in particular, but what I would say is that story really illustrates a major point for me that I bring up in the book, which is that the landscape is constantly changing. And what's important to me about that is that people during this time period were really aware of that. So they had a kind of, I would call it even an ecological awareness, or a sense that the land was shifting constantly, and what that meant for them is that they had to adapt to that landscape, and they had to find ways of living on it that will allow them to stay there permanently despite these changes. Yeah. And I feel like there's a real lesson that we might be able to learn from that today.
Even today, we have, because of the aquifer underneath us, we have politics that are directly related to the water. We have environmentalists who don't want us to build certain places, and I'm not disagreeing with them. I often think we should pay attention to that message. But and we have South Florida wanting sometimes to pump the water from this area.
Yes.
So it's political, and now we've got North Florida and Georgia filing a lawsuit with each other to get that water.
Oh,
yeah.
I didn't even know about that. That's so interesting.
Yeah, something about the oyster industry or something. It's not. I know, it doesn't even make sense. The oyster. I don't know. But the governor knows what he's talking about, I guess.
Does Cuba play a part in any part of this history?
Oh, sorry. Does what was that?
Cuba.
Oh, Cuba.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. It plays one of the roles it plays for me in this story is that the U.S. during the 19th century was trying to annex Cuba. I think they sort of thought, why not? Why not try to take all these places? And so that created a lot of conflict throughout the U.S. And the fact was that some of those maps I was talking about before, a lot of people use those to suggest, well, you know what? Actually, Cuba's kind of connected to us. It's just part of this mountain range, right? So we might as well just go take it. So yeah, that's one of the roles it plays. But also it plays a role in the wrecking industry. So I know in the book, maybe you brought this up before, I'm not sure, but when I talk about the Florida Reef, I'm often talking about the wreckers that live there, and that whole history of people who would wait along the reef, and they would wait for ships to wreck, U.S. ships carrying goods, and then they would go salvage those goods, and often they would take them to Cuba and to other ports. So these are U.S. goods that they would take, and then they would go sell to the highest bidder in these other ports. And so this was a real problem, if you can imagine, for people. So another one of the reasons that those local features of Florida are shaping broader concerns, broader politics. The U.S. basically saying we need to rein this in. This isn't working for us. So.
We live in a fascinating world, and Florida is a fascinating part of that world. This book tells this story in a way that I've never heard it told before. Michele Currie, Navakas, did they say it right that time?
Yes, you got it.
Navakas.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you so much for being on the air. I have a copy of Liquid Landscape right here. Call me if you want the hardcover copy that was sent to me. I did find it on Amazon, so I'm sure you can buy it there. Do you have a website you can direct us to?
I have my own website is michellenavakas.com, if you can figure out how to spell it.
Well, let me spell it for the listeners. It's N as in Nancy, Avakas. Did I get that right? Navakas.
Yeah, you did get it right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Don't go away. Let me give the book away, and then we'll say goodbye. Good morning. You've got the book.
Okay, this is Jim.
Jim, okay, you know where we are, right?
Yes, sir.
You've got it, Jim. It'll be waiting for you.
Yes, I can't wait to read this book. I love Florida history, especially detailed stuff like this.
Yes, this is fascinating stuff. Thank you, Jim. And Michele Currie, Navakas, thank you so much for being on the air with us today. Again, I found Liquid Landscape on Amazon, and you can go to Michelle's site as well. Thank you, Michele.
Thank you.
That was fun. All right, we will be right back.
The weather is brought to you by myfwc.com. Safe boating is no accident. Partly sunny and humid today with a brief shower or two near the coast in the afternoon. A high 84 to 89. Maybe a couple showers near the coast. Otherwise, partly cloudy tonight. A low 68 to 79. And partly sunny with some showers around tomorrow. High 84 to 89. Shower, thunderstorm, and some sun Saturday. High 85 to 88.
One of the best things about living in beautiful Central Florida is that we get to have a garden all year long. Spend some time on Tuesday mornings in the garden with Carol Ann Baldwin right here on WOCA The Source from 9 till 10 a.m. Carol Ann will take your phone calls, and she'll even check out your photos on her In the Garden Facebook page. Grab a tall glass of something refreshing and spend an hour in the garden with Carol Ann each Tuesday morning right here on The Source, WOCA.
Fox News Radio, I'm Chris Foster. Captured by terrorists in Afghanistan 5 years ago, Caitlin Coleman from Pennsylvania and her Canadian husband Joshua Boyle have been released in Pakistan along with 3 children born in